Welcome to our panel discussion today on China and patents. What is the right policy for the America First agenda? My name is Adam Mossoff. I am chair of the Forum for Intellectual Property and a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and I'm delighted to be moderating a fantastic panel of experts and thought leaders to address this vitally important question of what will be happening and what should happen in the next 4 years as the Trump administration and the United States government more generally implements this America First policy. Now, the America First agenda seeks to build a robust and thriving economy for the benefit of all Americans. I mean, that's well understood, and it's hard to argue with that. Most importantly, though, revitalizing patents and the patent system is really crucial to achieving this vision, something that's not talked about as much as it probably should be, and that we will be talking about in this panel. Reliable and effective patent rights have been key to a growing U.S. innovation economy from the founding era all the way up through today with our modern technologies in the 21st century. Patents and other intellectual property rights are critical for universities and startups, those classic market disruptors that President Donald Trump has referred to as little tech. These are the many engines of the U.S. innovation economy, creating jobs, growing our economy, really forming the lifeblood of the American dream for untold numbers of innovators and business persons over the past 2 centuries. Patents and intellectual property rights, therefore, have been key to creating jobs and improving the quality of life for all Americans, and ultimately have made America the global tech leader it is today. So I'm really delighted to have, as I mentioned, experts and thought leaders to talk about these important issues and to help frame, importantly, how patents and intellectual property rights should function within an America First agenda, especially given the rise of our global competitor, China, and with the hyper focus currently right now on China with respect to both our foreign policy and our economic policy and our innovation policy. So joining me today are three distinguished people. They have all had exemplary careers and have many accolades and achievements. So I will just be giving some basic information on them. And please use Google or ChatGPT or Grok if you want to find all of their many achievements and successes and other things about them. By order of simply alphabetical order by last name, we have the Honorable Andre Iancu, who is a partner at Sullivan Cromwell and the former Undersecretary of Commerce for Intellectual Property and Director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Next, we have Mark Cohen, who is Senior Technology Fellow at the Asia Society of Northern California. And last and certainly not least, we have Kirti Gupta, Chief Economist at Cornerstone Research. So I'm just going to kick us off with some questions to each of you, and then we'll jump into our conversation. So Andre, why don't you kick us off with situating for the audience kind of how reliable and effective patent rights have been a key part of American exceptionalism and thus are essential to the success of an America First policy agenda today.
Yeah, thanks, Adam, and good to be with everybody. Always great to be with Kirti and Mark on these really important topics. So look, it is hard to imagine a particular policy or set of laws to the American economy than a stable and reliable intellectual property system. And this has been true from the beginning of the foundation of this country, from the founding documents for the United States in the Constitution itself. The founders believed that the United States needs a system of laws that protects intellectual property. So in the body of the Constitution itself, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 outlines the intellectual property provisions for the future of the United States, where it says that Congress has the power to grant exclusive rights to authors and inventors for their respective writings and discoveries. So effectively the foundation of our copyright system and our patent system that has benefited us ever since. And indeed, in 1790, just within a few weeks of the establishment of the first government. George Washington signed into law the Patent Act of 1790. It was one of the very first bills passed by the new government at that time. And the founders understood that for an upstart nation like the United States in the 18th century, for us to be able to compete with the established powers out there, the United Kingdom and the like back in the day, we needed this system of laws. And what it has done, it has really worked as intended over time, and in fact, probably better than anybody envisioned. In light of this intellectual property system, the United States grew from, again, as out of nowhere, by the end of the 19th century to be the leader in innovation and new technologies, with Thomas Edison and the light bulb, Alexander Bell and the telephone, and then into the 20th century with Henry Ford and the automobile, the Wright brothers and the airplane, and then onto the computer age later in the 20th century, and then onto the information age, where we find ourselves today. At every step, the United States has led in this area. And I really don't believe, Adam, that any of this would have been possible in a free market system like we have in this country without the intellectual property system. First of all, the intellectual property system incentivizes inventors to innovate. More importantly, it incentivizes, or equally, at least equally as important, it incentivizes investors to invest in these extremely risky new technologies. And once the investments are made and the innovations are developed, the system of laws protects the inventions and protects those investments in the innovation down the line. In addition to all this, a reliable and predictable intellectual property system not only incentivizes and protects innovation, but it also enables collaboration and transfer of that innovation from the innovation lab, from the lab to the market in an organized fashion, so that inventors feel comfortable bringing their technologies to the market, to the free market, so in the comfort of knowing that they will be protected by the rule of law. Important to all of this, where we find ourselves today, is that if we have a reliable and effective, as you mentioned, Adam, if you have a reliable and effective system of intellectual property laws here in the United States, we enable our domestic innovation and investment in that innovation. But in addition to this, it attracts investment and innovation from the outside of the United States to come here and invest in innovation here in laboratories in the United States. Because again, they know that that investment will be protected once successful into the market. So for all of that to happen, both the domestic development, but also the attraction and reshoring manufacturing and development here in the United States, it simply cannot be done if inventors and investors, domestic and from overseas coming over, it just cannot be done if they do not believe that their investment will be protected, and it cannot happen without a reliable and effective and predictable intellectual property system. And in my view, if folks think that it could happen in another way, without such a system, it would be important for them to tell us when in history it did happen. Because innovation and development in the United States, from the beginning of the country, has never taken place without a system of laws that is established from our Constitution and forward. And there is no evidence that it could happen without it. So anyway, so I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the broader conversation.
Yeah. That fantastic overview, fantastic framing, and Curdy. So it was great that Andre kind of concluded on the point about evidence, right? Because we often hear from companies and especially in Silicon Valley and their leaders, Jack Dorsey and even Elon Musk, delete all IP. Um, that and they're supported by activists and academics that patents are at best a necessary evil or at worst actually blockade innovation and economic growth. I mean, so what is the evidence on this? As our resident economist here on our panel.
Yeah, thank you again, Adam. And by the way, about what we should do, I did want to put a quick plug for the report that Andre and I have been working at CSIS on and just released on the transition. It's a transition report for IP agenda for this administration.
Mhm.
Please take a look. It's called Promoting Innovation for IP for National Security. And pivoting to your point, I really appreciate Andre's view coming from sort of this, and yours, Adam, from the historical perspective of the legal system and why we had this constitutional uh, privilege of having intellectual property and what's its role. I think about this from an economist perspective, and the broader question you're asking is, so what is the role of innovation? What is the role of IP in driving innovation and economic growth? Like, is it true that it's this blockade, or is it true it helps? And I think we can do a very simple thought experiment here, right? First of all, let's just all agree that you need technology to drive economic growth. Now, of course, we know this. Robert Solow got a Nobel Prize in 1980s to explain that 80% of the growth comes from technology shocks, not from labor, not from capital. And I emphasize this because there's a lot of, you know, um, conversation these days about manufacturing jobs, and all that is great, but we need ultimately technology shocks. So what is driving that? And where does IP have a role, if any? So assume a world where there is no intellectual property. Then what happens? Who comes up with ideas and who innovates? And it's a simple thought experiment because, like, if you're an innovator, like you or me, you're starting a startup, for example, we're not, it's a large company that's already established, then what are your options? And your options are often to develop an idea and to either be able to productize it or to be able to license it or to be able to sell it. And by the way, before you do any of that, you need to generate some funding from a venture capital, most likely. And there's pretty robust literature in economics that shows that having intellectual property for your ideas does help in securing venture capital funding. So that's one. And the other is, like, if you really don't have intellectual property, I mean, this is something that's easy to understand. People invest where there is a return on investment. Businesses especially invest, where there is a return on investment, you naturally put your energy there. So if the whole purpose of the IP, the patent system, for example, is designed to make ideas a public good after a finite time frame and in return get a period of exclusive rights, right? So if you know that, well, you're going to have to make your idea public and you won't get an exclusive right in return and you can't monetize it, then it's not like people will stop innovating, but innovation will look different. People are going to want to monetize their ideas, which is 80% of the growth, remember, in different ways. They're going to go to other mechanisms. And the way I think about it as an economist is like vertical integration, right? You have an idea, your only method is to productize it, to integrate vertically, right? So you're limited in this. You have to have scale for that, for many innovations. The other is you use conglomerate effects, or let me explain simply, like you monetize with adjacent markets. And we know this, we see this in tech all the time. You invest in technology A, you give it away for free because you're monetizing something that is adjacent to it in technology B. So
Mhm.
really, it gives an advantage if you already have scale and you have a conglomerate effect, or if you can vertically integrate. And it makes it difficult for startups and SMEs to be able to enter without those advantages. So yeah, I mean, innovation will probably happen, but we're removing one of the important mechanisms in the economy without without this IP system.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's how I think about it.
Okay. No, that's excellent. It's excellent survey. Yes. And of kind of the trade-offs in between, when you have IP and when you don't, and what type and where that drives development and innovation and economic growth. And of course, what's driving all of this, of course, as a policy matter, is the rise of China as a competitive threat in our modern world in the 21st century. Something that no one foresaw 40 years ago or 50 years ago. Although Mark, you probably did, and you were probably felt very much like you were Cassandra at the time, saying this. So given your extensive expertise and knowledge about this space, so what is help us frame for us and the audience? What's the nature of China's competitive threat to the U.S. today, and how have patents functioned in China's domestic industrial policies and geopolitical goals? And we often hear it's all bad, oh my God, they're stealing our IP and they're doing this. So are there actually any practices that might be good that the U.S. might actually learn from China at the current point in our competition globally?
All great questions, and if we had time, I would make it a 3-credit class with a paper from everybody, because it really
You just taught in 2 days ago.
The questions are complicated, and they also point to some of the differences between the U.S. and the Chinese system and the challenges that China poses, not only to sector-specific areas of technology, which we're increasingly hearing about in both the economic context and the national security context, but also the potential for China to lead on IP policy if it's successful, either in the current trade war or with the developing world. We may find that the future of IP looks quite different if it's a China-dominated world. I suspect it would be quite different. The biggest difference between China and the U.S., in my view, and this is a shade of gray, but nonetheless, it's a significant shade of gray, is that China primarily has a statist approach to intellectual property. There's a lot of innovation occurring in the private sector, don't get me wrong, but you have a system that's based on 5-year plans, that's based on subsidies and intervention, that's trying to guide the macro economy in particular directions, that has a lot of really interesting IP intensive institutions. By that, I mean bureaucracies, specialized IP courts, judges, prosecutors, among many others, that has really taken IP to heart. I mean, I sometimes wonder if all the 301 investigations by USTR beginning in the 90s of China's IP regime had the inadvertent effect of mobilizing China on IP far more than the US has mobilized since then. In fact, I think we've somewhat demobilized. I agree with a lot of Andre's assertions. So we've created a bit of a monster in intellectual property that really, to a large part, endorses intellectual property, and we see it quantitatively. We see it in the Chinese Patent Office being several multiples in size of the U.S. Patent Office, Trademark Office also being extremely large. A lot of low quality stuff as well, which is kind of classic, kind of socialist manufacturing, if you will, and also integration of IP into school curricula, and beginning at an early age, and the like. Just a lot of indicators that China has really embraced it, that China is a large IP economy. And beginning about 10 or so years ago, China's leadership said, no, we don't only want to be a large IP economy, we want to be a strong IP economy. And so that's a qualitative difference, and that's the one that poses the greatest threat to U.S. leadership, and possibly not only to leadership in IP, but economic leadership and innovation leadership. I agree very strongly with Andre's observations on our strengths. I think our strengths remain in a market-based approach, and rule of law, and independent judiciary, and the like. I'm not suggesting that we should embrace China's approaches, which often are the contrary to what I just said. Transparency is another, by the way, key component, and I'll come back to that later. But that being said, China does give us a laboratory on how certain things could be changed in the U.S., and that might be worth considering. Some of them will be extremely difficult. For example, China's law and legislation mandates that laws should not be retroactive. This could be really interesting in terms of as you look at U.S. Supreme Court decisions on patent eligibility in other areas where they basically scaled back from the legislation. So it's supposed to be progressive leaning, if you will. I think China also has done a remarkable job on access to justice issues on IP. And I know a lot of folks may think we already have too many patents and patentees, but the utility model system is huge. The design system is huge. The enforcement system, the administrative system is cheap and quick. And the courts decide first instance cases in 6 months, second instance in 3 months. These are important advantages, not only in global competition for hosting IP cases, but also when there's parallel cases. China will often be the first jurisdiction to decide an internationally complex parallel litigation. All these are big advantages. We might be able to learn something on how they've gotten China energized on IP. That being said, I think it's really important to understand, and you kind of introduced this observation already when you said, I might have felt like a Cassandra in the past, predicting where things might go. I think the US and the West has been very naive about China's emergence, and that we've also often chosen narratives that support our strengths rather than look at our weaknesses. The reality is, China is not the first communist economy to embrace intellectual property. Russia was once one of the 10 largest IP offices in the world. It held that role for about 5 to 10 years. And North Korea has a patent clause in its constitution, and some autocratic societies like Nazi Germany conducted many reforms in IP. And autocracy doesn't say, I'm not going to get involved in IP because it's a market economy tool. They're saying, I'm going to get involved in IP if it enhances my power, either individually or my state. And we've seen how China has embraced IP for that purpose. And that's part of the reason it presents a really important threat to the US in terms of our ability to innovate and our ability to lead on global IP policy. That competition, I hope, is going to be one between a market-based system like the US and a non-market-based system, which is fundamentally the Chinese, that it doesn't become a hotter competition than that. But I think it's really important that we, pass some of the pending legislation on eligibility, on injunctive relief. China gives injunctive relief whenever there's a finding of infringement. It's 95+% grants of injunctive relief for patent infringement, and the US has fallen way behind. So there's stuff we can learn in terms of upping our game. But I think the fundamentals, and again, I will say this, I agree with Andre, the fundamentals are a market system and rule of law.
Adam, if I can just add on to what Mark just said, and we'll get to the bills, I'm sure, in pending bills in a minute. But on the economics, there is, as Mark indicates, there is a fundamental difference between a patent system that's used in an authoritarian regime, in a virtual dictatorship where the free market is not quite what we consider to be free here in the United States, versus a free market economy as we have here in the United States. I just want to emphasize the important difference here and why IP and the stable IP system is so important in our system. In our system, there is no mechanism other than really private investment to innovate. Whereas in an authoritarian regime, where all the companies and the economy effectively report into the central government can dictate what the innovation plan is for the United States and where the investments should be made. So, for example, in the Soviet Union, while their people for a very long time were starving, they directed huge amounts of money towards the space race. That was not a free market development. It was what the government decided to do, and they were successful at it for a while. In China, the central government dictates there in their Made in China 2025, 2030 plans and the like, what the innovation plan is for the whole country, and then it can dictate where companies, what technologies the companies should invest in and to what extent. None of that is possible here in the United States, and we shouldn't do it. We've benefited from the very beginning in this country by the entrepreneurship of our people, by the free market system where companies, investors take risks and companies go head to head and compete, and they struggle, and then whoever has the best mousetrap will win. That has been very beneficial. And that system, where the central government cannot dictate, that system cannot happen without an intellectual property system, where the rule of law incentivizes and protects those innovations and that investment. It is a critical difference. And we just cannot do it without it. And various systems of prize money and the like have been tried and failed. They're absolutely ineffective. The only thing we know from the foundation of this country till now is that a reliable intellectual property system works. Now, can we learn something from the authoritarian regimes about some things that in the IP system that works there? I guess, certainly if they enter injunctions when there is infringement, we certainly should not be for the weaker on that. That seems odd. But by and large, IP is meant to be a free market tool, and we need to guard it jealously and be very protective of this system and strengthen it to the extent possible for the system, for our economy to operate at its greatest capacity.
Yeah, your remarks really kind of raise then that the next thought that I had, which is, and I want to ask Curdy this question, given this kind of awesome new paper that she and Mark just released at CSIS again on China as a kind of a innovation powerhouse, so to speak, right? So a lot of people claim, especially in DC now, right, that China is winning the global tech race. And they've directed their resources in the way that Andre has described, and that and I think it's indisputable that China is definitely ahead in some areas of technologies like batteries and electric vehicles and things of that sort. But one of the things we often hear about, and one of the really important technologies is high tech and global telecommunications and cellular technologies. And something that we often hear is that China is actually now leading in this space. They're leading the technologies in what the deployment of 5G and in the creation of 6G. So I'd really like to ask Curdy, and I know that you addressed this with Mark in your recent report. So kind of maybe talk a little bit about this, and is this really happening? Are they leading in the high tech space in the way that they're leading in other areas of technology?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I mean, that is exactly the fundamental question, and we try to address them in our CSIS report as well. We look at like various important technologies from a national security perspective, not just telecommunications, but artificial intelligence, pharmaceuticals, bio, agriculture, even, right? Which are tend to be more patent reliant on intellectual property than other technologies because of high risk, because of long-term investments you need to make upfront before you start getting returns. And then it's risky. You don't know, for example, biopharmaceuticals, very few drugs, even once they reach the clinical trials reach. And same thing for 5G, 6G, right? Like you need to invest in this cycle of generational cellular, my area, for a decade before you see those technologies, cross your desks. So I think the answer is the gap is certainly closing. I think we have to see the data and face it that, for some time now, Chinese government incentivized and other companies have doubled down on their investments. I mean, sort of like if I take the macro view and I show you the investments in R&D from different countries around the world at a country level, US is still in a lead position. all the other countries like stay flat line over 20 years, and China's line for R&D is increasing like this, and the gap between US and China is closing. And the micro view is not that different. I mean, that's how you see, data from patents, you see data from contributions, you see data from how much, companies are showing up, how, in terms of revenues and sales, of course, it's colored by, some of the trade war related, export controls and tariffs. So I think it's, we've kind of put the brakes temporarily for some time, I think, but not for that long, right? Huawei came up with its announcement of a 5G chip that's powering smartphones, and there is demand for those chips and those smartphones in the rest of the world. So I think we gotta face that. We gotta realize that, yeah, in many technologies areas, even if, like unlike electric vehicles, I think where China is a clear leader, the gap is certainly closing. I will say something though, that maybe we did a whole webinar on at some point, like when, because I also think about this from an economist valuation perspective, one has to think about just not just the quantity, but also the quality of inventions when making those assertions and when doing that analysis, and be careful and thoughtful about it. And that is where you need some expertise, because you really need to know a little bit about, okay, I'm not just going to count patents. I'm going to think about how to weigh them based on certain, quality metrics, not just, simple observable things like citations, but also think about, okay, where in the technology cycle are these inventions coming? How core are these inventions? How fundamental are they? Because look, whenever there is a counting game, it's easy to game the system. And when there are incentives that are very powerfully driven incentives, then even more so. So I think it requires more like skilled analysis to really try to tease out where and how we measure this closing gap. Mark, you would
If
love
I,
to jump in.
yeah, if I could just add a few observations on that. The U.S. was one of the pioneers in future-oriented technology analyses. Actually, the former Office of Technology Assessment in Congress developed a lot of these approaches, and I think the U.S. has fallen behind as an area of technology unto itself and how we predict technological advances and achievements. And I know I have a lot of personal stories. One time I recited a magazine article to a senior tech official in the US, and he turned to me and said, "You used to be in the government. Were you with the CIA?" I said, "No, if you spent $1 a month, you could subscribe to this magazine in Chinese as well." That's the level of depth of some of the Chinese articles on technology competition that I saw coming out even 10, 15 years ago. So this is like really, really important. I think China's in a transition mode as well now, not just in high tech or 5G, 6G. We're seeing this in biotech, where China's becoming a major outbound licensor. We're also seeing new approaches to assessing technological competitiveness, not just patents or scientific publications or talent, but also things like diffusion and scalability of technology, which actually sometimes weigh against China, but also very important in calculating whether the US and or China will be dominant in certain technological areas. So I think this whole area of FTAs, future-oriented technology assessments, and how the USG should adopt them, use them, or encourage them in industry as well, is really important. Another one of my favorite ways of approaching, there's lots of kind of shortcuts in doing them, and one of them just came up recently when I mentioned to a company looking at battery technology. Did you look at when the patents were filed? So why should I do that? See how many patents are filed between October, November, and the end of the year. And why would you do that? Because that's an indication of end-of-year subsidies and money going into the entity. And sure enough, they came back to me and says, "Yeah, there's a lot of end-of-year patents." And my suspicion is those are probably lower quality patents, probably less likely to be maintained, et cetera. But we'll see as time passes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great points. In fact, I think everyone on this on this panel is signed this statement that we issued in 2020 at Hudson called 5G Technological Leadership, where we address the phenomenon of people just counting patents, as Curdy mentioned, as a way to measure kind of the innovation race between China and the United States, and we address the problems with patent counting that she described, and maybe we should reissue that now in the context of 6G, so that people think that it's relevant. Still realize that it's still relevant, not just think it's relevant, it still is relevant. But the points that Mark and Curdy raised, that China is closing the gap, and that and as Andre said earlier, they've directed massive amounts of resources towards innovation in next generation technologies. And so there's been a response that we've heard from this in the context of the America First agenda in DC that said, all right, then, if China is doing this and is a threat to us, then we should respond to this competitive threat by doing things like prohibiting Chinese inventors from obtaining patents or from enforcing the existing patents that they own in the United States. Andre, what do you think about those proposals? I mean, is that the way that we should respond to this threat? All right, fine, let's cut ourselves off from and cut off our patent system from China as a way to kind of balance the playing field?
No, I don't think that's an economically sound approach, first of all. And second of all, it is not aligned with an America First agenda, or frankly speaking, as somebody from the first Trump administration, I don't think it's aligned with a Republican philosophy when it comes to property rights. In order to compete both domestically and internationally, we shouldn't. One of the tools should not be the taking of private property rights, and patents and other forms of intellectual property are property rights. In order to compete, you don't want to weaken those things. If anything, you want to strengthen American intellectual property rights. If you strengthen American intellectual property rights, what you're going to do is attract more investment into the United States, so that you will have more domestic development. So if you want to reshore various technologies, take for example silicon fabs. We invented Silicon Valley. Okay, we have a place named after this area of technology. And but now we in the United States make virtually no advanced silicon chips, or a very, very small percentage of what we actually use. We import virtually all, or the vast, vast majority of computer chips, advanced computer chips that we use. If we want to reshore that, as one example, you have to make sure that the technologies that come here, the innovations that come from those technologies, will be protected under the rule of law, whether it's US companies that will rebuild factories back here in the United States instead of using foreign factories in foreign lands, or foreign companies that you want to attract to build their factories here. For both of those investors want to be assured that what they develop here is protected by the rule of law. Now, the argument could be made from the other side, I suppose, that sure, we agree with what I just said, but we're talking about one specific country only that's behaving badly when it comes to IP and other such things, because they steal IP and the like. And China certainly is responsible for a very, very significant amount of intellectual property theft. That's true. So the argument is, well, let's prevent them from using IP here in the United States. As soon as you do that, though, you lead to a fragmentation of the intellectual property system. So if we start banning patents, if we start discriminating our intellectual property rights based on the country of origin of the inventor, for example, or the owner of that intellectual property. Who knows who is going to be next on the list? So the investors lose confidence on their investments in the United States down the line. More importantly, it can very well lead to retaliation from the impacted countries. So keep in mind that when it comes to IP, we have a very significant trade surplus. We export much more IP than we import, and that would harm us on balance. But even without that, if we discriminate against the IP of a particular country and they discriminate against the IP from our country, that will stifle our ability to innovate and transfer that innovation. And that will lead to segmentation of innovation, and therefore, long run, less innovation from American inventors and investors. So I think I'm very sympathetic to the goal, okay, to the goal of reshoring American manufacturing and American innovation. They go hand in hand, by the way. I'm very sympathetic to the goal of stopping theft of Chinese IP, of IP by the Chinese, and I'm very sympathetic to the goal of enabling American innovation to retake the lead in the various areas of technology for the future. Very sympathetic to all of those things. But all of those things are entirely congruous with a strong intellectual property system, with a non-discriminatory intellectual property system. And trying to start discriminating or weakening our IP laws in any way has the exact opposite effect, in my view, I'm afraid.
Can I just add? I mean, to me, from an economist perspective, it feels a little bit like a ostrich putting their head in the sand, because you can take the IP system and you can say, all right, walled garden, we're not gonna assign IP to foreign inventors, and we're gonna deny those rights. You can siphon yourself off of the international global market. You can't do that. That still exists. So you can, like, it's just if you don't see it, it's still there. So I think it just gives us a disadvantage in competing in the global market, and takes away the legs again of the inventors to be able to sell their technologies globally and to be able to protect their ideas and inventions that are propelling those products. So it doesn't see how that works. And by the way, in the meantime, the statistics I was just quickly looking up from China is that since 2020, the SIPO has quadrupled its patent applications and doubled the patents granted to foreign inventors.
Yeah.
So
Mark,
important data. I just want to add a few quick things here. One is I second Andrei's concerns about what I would call a balkanized IP environment if you start sanctioning or depriving countries of particular rights. I think that would be highly problematic. And in fact, historically, the Paris Convention, which was 1883, said every member is entitled to national treatment. This predates the GATT. This predates the WTO. We were there with national treatment and MFN treatment before this became an issue in tariffs. And I think it would be a really bad signal, not just for IP, but for the global trading system. That being said, I think I still go back to this notion of private rights. And I believe, although this is probably not anything the Trump administration would want to hear, that bringing a WTO case, for example, on private rights in intellectual property, which is in the preamble to the TRIPS agreement, that IP are private rights, could be an important signaling exercise about why certain countries need to change their IP environment to be fully compatible with the international regime. I don't think the US has made that case. I don't think any country has made that case. That provision in the TRIPS agreement was drafted by the Hong Kong delegation when Hong Kong was part of a British colony to the WTO. And I think it would be worth making that point louder and globally because it's a fundamental breaking off point that we have with China on IP.
Yeah, it's interesting, Mark, that you mentioned, the WTO because, the EU filed a complaint in the WTO against China, which actually the WTO then ruled against the EU and said that you didn't prove your complaint, that China and my understanding is the US joined that complaint in support of it, and that in the gravamen of the complaint is that China was misusing its courts to favor its own kind of, domestic, champions, Huawei and others, uh, in discriminating against Western innovators like Ericsson and Nokia, and we could add InterDigital and Qualcomm to that, in terms of artificially depressing royalty rates for 5G and things of this sort. So what has China been doing in its court cases, in which companies like Ericsson or U.S. telecommunications companies like Qualcomm, right, are in litigation with Chinese tech companies? Earlier you mentioned, hey, you can get an injunction and things of this sort, but are the rules being applied equally in China?
Well, I think China has learned from the worst of the West in terms of things like aggressively issuing anti-suit injunctions, even if the parties don't stipulate that they want China to set a global rate or to be the only court to hear a particular case. They've gone a little further in some respects. For example, although Standards Essential Patent Licensing from ETSI, the European Telecommunication Standards Institute, is governed by French law, I don't know of a single Chinese SEP case where French law was applied, or even where there was an expert witness on French law. So they've gone ahead and created their own doctrine, if you will, around it. In fact, since they back it into the civil law, the civil code in China, they say fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory, these terms that come out of FRAND. They say, well, we have those concepts in the civil code. And as a consequence, I believe we're seeing FRAND outside of the SEP context. So, for example, in collective management licensing for copyright, they're applying FRAND. In non-IP behavioral remedies and antitrust, they're applying FRAND. Xi Jinping, when he talks about access to pharmaceuticals during the pandemic, he mentions FRAND. So you kind of taken, as I said, the worst of the West. Okay, you have a concept that could be easily abused, and now it's being launched more globally. The new WTO case that was filed by Europe is also very interesting because that deals with global rate setting, and I think that was really kind of China often behaves as if you have one policy, they have a counter policy. So EU files a case on anti-suit injunctions, and China says, okay, we'll skip that. We'll just set rates globally without even bothering to enjoin the foreign court. And this is a bit more problematic. But I also hasten to add that although the US joined the first EU case, when it came to the issue of transparency, that is the availability of decisions involving, in this case, anti-suit injunctions, the EU more or less sided with China on a transparency issue, and that issue involved internal judicial policies on anti-suit injunctions. I think this was very regrettable. If you had nothing good to say, it was probably better just to keep quiet in this case. But in reality, the USTR brief supports China. I really hope that, as we've all said, that if we're going to have a market-based system and we're really going to continue to support it, transparency is key. And I hope that the current administration takes a very different approach to this issue.
Yeah, well, we're coming up to the top of the hour, so I want to it's it's interesting, by the way, that you mentioned that this kind of back and forth, the responses and reactions to various policy and legal actions, because that's the evidence of what Andre was talking about earlier. If we shut off our patent system to China, they will retaliate. I mean, and that's not a hypothetical. That's not scaremongering. We've seen this back and forth already in the international context, in the IP policy and legal debates. But we've been talking a lot about, and we've heard references to, the America First agenda really should be about strengthening our patent system, strengthening our IP system. It shouldn't be about closing ourselves off to the global innovation economy and creating unnecessary frictions, both political and economic, with our relations with other countries. So maybe we can end on some kind of if you were if you had the ear of President Trump and could make one recommendation to him, or if you could wave a magic wand and get all the members of Congress to listen to you and to act on your recommendation, what would be, your advice, your recommendation as a clear advance of an America First agenda? And Let's go kind of in reverse order here from our opening remarks. So Mark, why don't you kick us off, and then we'll conclude.
Okay. No surprises here. I have three recommendations: transparency, transparency, and transparency. And I think that too often, and the example of the phase one agreement is perfectly legitimate here. We get great commitments out of China, but they're not capable of being verified. And I think we have to front load the verification part in any future negotiations and anything involving commercial law, particularly IP. And we should also encourage our allies to do the same, because they're going to run into the same exact problem. The EU did not get a firm endorsement of its view of transparency out of the WTO. This is really up to all of us to do bilaterally and multilaterally. So this is critical. Without it, IP is incapable of being strategized by the private sector, and IP commitments are incapable of being verified.
Yeah. All right. Gertie?
Andre, you're gonna love this. I would say, like, make IP part of the economic toolkit. So let me just quickly clarify: make IP part of the economic toolkit. Right now that we're talking about tariffs, commerce is talking about export controls, trade issues, but intellectual property isn't on the table. It can't be viewed as a silo. It has to be part of the toolkit.
Okay. Now, Andre?
Well, I don't know about just picking one thing, Adam. It's like your favorite, pick your favorite child or something. But I will say, first of all, at the very practical level, there are a few bills pending in Congress on strengthening the patent system in the United States. It's the Restore Act on injunctions, the Prevail Act on the PTAB, and PIRA on Section 101. They are all very reasonable bills. They are balanced. They would return balance and predictability to the patent system in the United States, which has been weakened in a variety of ways over the past couple of decades. And if the administration supports these bills, as I think it should, it would go a long way towards passing them. So that's number one in practical, and this is an immediate thing that can happen right now. Long term and at a higher level, philosophically, I think it's critically important for the United States to project domestically and internationally that intellectual property is a critically important point for our economy, for the free market economy, and for the national security of the United States and the West. Protecting and strengthening intellectual property is a leading factor in all the efforts the administration is trying to advance when it comes to the economy and national security and international collaboration. So those would be my overall goals. Apologize, it's not just one, but I think they're all imminently doable.
Well, I have three children and there's three bills, so I completely relate to you can't just select one. But no, I think it was the fantastic closing remarks. I hope that some policymakers, some staffers will be watching this and are watching this, and will potentially take these ideas into consideration. Well, you're all very busy people, so really appreciate that you have taken some time out of your very busy schedules, very valuable time to share your insights and thoughts on these really important matters lawmakers as we kind of are continuing to see an evolving policy agenda with the new administration and with the new Congress. And hopefully your ideas on transparency and recognizing that intellectual property is essential to economic development and recognizing the need to strengthen our IP through the various reform bills and other measures will be all implemented as part of this new America First agenda that is being put into practice. Thank you very much again, and we'll stay tuned for more.
Thank you, Adam, for organizing.
Thank you, Adam. Andre and Curdy,
Well,
thank you.